I adopt this worthy young man as my son, Lucius Claudius Nero.
He called himself an artist, but history remembers him as a monster. He ruled the most powerful empire on Earth, then set it on fire. From a teenage emperor controlled by his mother to a man who killed her and married a boy dressed as his dead wife. Nero's story is not just about power, it's about obsession, paranoia, and a fall so dramatic, Rome still talks about it. This isn't just the story of Nero, it's the unraveling of an emperor who confused cruelty with greatness and turned the world's most powerful empire into his personal stage. Now, let's go back to where the madness began. Nero was born in 37 AD into one of the most volatile families the Roman Empire had ever produced. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, had a violent temper and a reputation for cruelty, even by Roman standards. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was the sister of Emperor Caligula and a direct descendant of Augustus himself. That meant Nero was born into power, but also into danger. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was not a family. It was a chain of survival games, and Nero was a pawn from birth. Domitius Ahenobarbus, Nero's father, died in AD 41 when Nero was just 3. But his death didn't erase the damage he left behind. Domitius had been disgraced in a high-profile political scandal and charged with corruption, cruelty, and open disrespect toward imperial authority. By the time he was gone, his name carried more shame than honor. For Agrippina, this meant more work. She wasn't just building a successor, she was scrubbing the blood off his legacy. By the time he could walk, Nero's world was already soaked in blood and betrayal. Caligula didn't trust Agrippina. He viewed her as a threat and forced her into exile, removing her from court and taking full control over Nero's early years. Without protection, Nero was raised away from his mother, shuffled between guardians, never truly secure. He was not a prince. He was a political liability that could be killed or used at any time Rome didn't protect imperial children. It weaponized them. This early separation from Agrippina left Nero in a permanent state of emotional distance. Every bond he formed in childhood was temporary. Every adult in his life answered to someone higher. He quickly learned that loyalty wasn't earned, it was rented. Everything about his early years trained him to view power not as a responsibility, but as the only defense against being eliminated. When you grow up disposable, you learn fast how to play the long game. And for Agrippina, the long game had already begun. While in exile, she waited, she watched. She stayed close enough to the throne to survive, but far enough to avoid suspicion. She studied the court's patterns and saw the cracks forming in Caligula's rule. She wasn't interested in revenge. She was interested in strategy. She didn't need to punish Caligula. She just needed to outlive him and be ready when the throne changed hands again. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, Agrippina made her move. She returned to Rome, not as a grieving sister, but as a calculating political survivor. Her son had been sidelined, but she hadn't forgotten him. She understood one thing better than anyone else in the palace. If she couldn't protect Nero with soldiers, she would protect him with power. And to get that power, she needed a new target, her uncle, the newly crowned Emperor Claudius. Claudius wasn't a natural emperor. He was installed by the Praetorian Guard after Caligula's assassination, mostly because he was weak enough to control. He stuttered, limped, and lacked charisma, but he had the title, and that made him useful. Agrippina saw opportunity. She stayed quiet in public, but behind closed doors, she moved like a general. She knew how to make herself seem harmless, even while planning her next political strike. She studied Claudius carefully, learning what made him tick. He was a man of habit. distracted by writing history and trusting the wrong people. His biggest vulnerability was loneliness, and Agrippina stepped into that gap with perfect timing. Within months, she positioned herself close enough to him that senators began whispering. Her rivals underestimated her until their influence started slipping. One by one, her enemies lost favor. And then she made her final play: marriage. Agrippina married Claudius in 49 AD. It was politically controversial since he was her uncle, but legality was never her obstacle. Optics were. She simply changed the optics. She presented herself as the solution to palace instability, a respectable woman of imperial blood, offering loyalty and experience. Behind the curtain, she was eliminating threats, using marriage alliances, blackmail, and calculated kindness to push Nero into position. Her goal was singular: power through her son. She began reshaping Nero's public image. She forced the Senate to see him not as a boy, but as the legitimate heir of Augustus. Nero's portraits appeared alongside Claudius's. Coins were minted with his face. Even though Claudius already had a son, Britannicus, Agrippina made sure Nero's name was louder, cleaner, and more imperial. She became a one-woman campaign machine, and nobody in the empire could match her relentlessness. But Agrippina knew that status wasn't enough. Nero needed legal superiority. So she pushed Claudius to adopt him. Officially, legally, and publicly, Claudius, under pressure and aging, agreed. Nero became the adopted son of the emperor, placing him ahead of Britannicus in succession. On paper, it looked like a family decision. In reality, it was a strategic takeover. The only question now was how long Claudius would live. In AD 51, at only 13 years old, Nero formally entered public life as an adult. Wearing the toga virilis, speaking before the Senate, and standing beside Claudius at public events, Nero was presented not as a child, but as a leader in training. Seneca carefully crafted his image, and Agrippina orchestrated every appearance to signal one thing: the empire's future was already here, and it looked nothing like Britannicus. 2 years later, at age 16, Nero married Claudia Octavia, his stepsister and Claudius's biological daughter. The union was staged to strengthen Nero's legal claim and bind him to the imperial bloodline. Claudius believed the marriage would settle the court, but it only deepened Agrippina's control. Octavia had no influence, and Nero showed little affection. What mattered wasn't love, it was consolidation. Nero had become adopted heir, son-in-law, and now the visible face of succession. Nothing stood between him and the throne, except Claudius. With adoption secured, Agrippina shifted into phase 2, controlling the machinery of power from behind the curtain. She brought back Seneca, the philosopher and former court insider who had been exiled years earlier. She didn't want a teacher, she wanted a sculptor. Seneca was tasked with shaping Nero into a prince the public could admire, educated, eloquent, and obedient. Every speech, every appearance, every gesture was rehearsed to perfection. To ensure physical control over the capital, Agrippina also aligned with Sextus Afranius Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. Burrus wasn't loyal to her, he was loyal to order, but she convinced him that Nero meant stability and Britannicus meant chaos. With Seneca shaping Nero's mind and Burrus managing his protection, Agrippina built a parallel government. Her son might not have been emperor yet, but she ruled as if he were. The imperial court slowly started to bend toward Nero. He received honors, official roles, and a presence at public ceremonies usually reserved for seasoned leaders. Claudius, increasingly old and isolated, began to fade into the background. Britannicus, once considered the natural heir, became invisible inside the palace. Everyone saw what was coming, but no one dared to stop it. Agrippina had made it clear: Nero was the future, and everyone else was temporary. And then came the moment that removed all obstacles. In 54 AD, Claudius fell ill after a banquet. The food had been served by palace staff loyal to Agrippina. Historical sources differ on whether it was poisoned mushrooms or a slow-acting toxin, but what mattered was the outcome. Claudius died that night. His physician claimed it was natural. Others claimed he never had a chance. No investigation followed. Rome didn't ask questions it didn't want answered. By sunrise, Agrippina had already locked down the palace and arranged Nero's ascension. He was just 16 years old. The Senate, Praetorian Guard, and military all backed the decision without resistance. The empire had a new emperor, and standing behind him, controlling the message, the room, and the future, was the woman who had engineered it all. Nero had no idea what kind of world he just inherited, but everyone else did. In October of AD 54, Rome awoke to a new emperor, 16-year-old Nero Claudius Caesar. He was young, charming, and publicly presented as a beacon of stability after Claudius's sudden death. But everyone in the palace knew that it wasn't Nero pulling the strings. His rise was engineered by his mother, Agrippina, who had positioned herself as the architect of Rome's future. Behind every proclamation was her hand. Behind every ceremony, her calculation. Nero wore the purple, but Agrippina sat beside the throne. To avoid panic over the young ruler's inexperience, Agrippina quickly installed two stabilizers. Seneca, the philosopher-statesman who wrote Nero's speeches, and Sporus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. Together, they managed perception. Seneca crafted Nero's public image as fair and reasonable. Sporus ensured no factions stirred unrest. From day one, Nero's voice was rehearsed, his gestures curated. Even the way he smiled in front of senators was practiced. The boy was the face. The adults around him were the system. In the early months, Nero surprised many by approving policies that felt almost merciful. He reduced unfair taxes, ordered the release of political prisoners, and removed secret informants installed under Claudius. He even allowed senators to speak more freely during debates, at least on paper. These reforms were more about appearances than substance, but they worked. The Senate began to breathe. After years of fear under Caligula and the rigid control of Claudius, Nero felt like fresh air. The Roman public, too, responded well. Crowds cheered during public appearances. Nero participated in games, sponsored theater, and lowered grain prices to win support. Young, handsome, and well-spoken, he became the symbol of a new era, at least to those who didn't know what was happening behind the walls of the Palatine Palace. In truth, every decision passed through Agrippina. She ran the inner circle. She approved appointments, she reviewed speeches, and she made sure Nero knew exactly who he owed everything to. But beneath the surface, tension was already building. Nero was emperor, but he had no room to grow. His mother's presence hovered over every room. She entered meetings uninvited. She sat beside him in official audiences. She expected obedience, not partnership. The court whispered it, but Nero lived it. He had the title. She had the power. And in Rome, when power doesn't shift naturally, someone has to take it by force. Agrippina had no interest in stepping aside once Nero was crowned. She believed the empire was her reward, earned through years of sacrifice and strategy. From the beginning of his reign, she appeared at official meetings not as a guest, but as a commanding figure. She stood beside her son as if they ruled jointly. No one could approach Nero without her permission. Every official request passed through her private staff. It was an empire filtered through a mother's grip. Foreign envoys were stunned by her involvement. When diplomats from Armenia and Parthia arrived, it was Agrippina, not Nero, who greeted them first. She issued instructions to governors, signed off on financial directives, and demanded that her image be placed on coins alongside Nero's. For the first time in Roman history, a living woman's face shared imperial currency with a reigning emperor. The Senate was rattled. They had tolerated her ambition. Now they feared her authority. Even in the domestic space, Agrippina's control tightened. She treated Octavia, Nero's wife, with open disdain. The marriage had always been political, but Agrippina ensured it stayed cold and mechanical. She warned Nero against taking lovers, monitored his private conversations, and blocked his access to advisors she didn't trust. When Nero spent time with actors or musicians, she accused him of tarnishing the family name. She didn't want a son, she wanted a tool. That control extended beyond his marriage. Agrippina began removing people from Nero's circle. Old allies were pushed out, young favorites were kept close, but monitored. Every relationship was evaluated for threat potential. Nero's palace felt less like a court and more like a trap. Burrus and Seneca tried to mediate, but even they feared her reach. A single misstep could result in exile, or worse. Agrippina believed she had earned permanent control, and she wasn't letting go. For Nero, the pressure began to warp his sense of self. He no longer felt like a ruler, but a hostage dressed in royal robes. Friends whispered that he needed to take control, but every attempt to act independently was blocked, criticized, or reversed. His resentment turned inward, then outward. He stopped confiding in his mother. He stopped answering her letters. And in his silence, a dangerous idea began to form. Maybe Rome wasn't big enough for both of them. The first real sign of defiance came quietly. Nero stopped, including Agrippina in meetings. He delayed her messages, declined her dinner invitations, and began surrounding himself with people she disliked. Chief among them was Poppaea Sabina, a beautiful, clever, married noblewoman who quickly became more than just a romantic interest. Poppaea understood court politics, she knew how to build influence, and she knew how to speak directly to Nero's growing hatred of control. Agrippina was enraged. She accused Poppaea of seduction, manipulation, and betrayal. But Nero didn't care. In Poppaea, he saw something his mother never gave him: respect without strings. Agrippina's jealousy turned political. She began confronting Nero in front of his staff, calling him ungrateful, careless, and soft. She reminded him she had made him emperor, that without her, he'd still be living in the shadow of Britannicus. Nero heard the words, but all he felt was threat. When pressure didn't work, Agrippina escalated. She warned Nero that if he continued to shut her out, she would shift her support to Britannicus, the son of Claudius and the biological heir Nero had replaced. Though younger, Britannicus had a direct bloodline and support in the Senate. He still held sympathy among Roman elites. Agrippina's threat was real. If she championed him, the empire could fracture, and Nero knew it. The response was swift. Nero moved to isolate Britannicus completely. His meals were monitored, his movements restricted, allies were watched. Seneca and Burrus didn't intervene. They knew the risks of open rivalry. A decision had been made. Agrippina had overplayed her hand, and if she was willing to weaponize Britannicus, Nero was willing to remove the threat before it matured. He no longer needed her protection, only her silence. During a palace banquet in February AD 55, Britannicus drank from a cup of wine and collapsed within minutes. He gasped, trembled, and died in front of the court. Nero remained seated. His expression didn't change. Agrippina stood frozen, realizing the truth too late. There were no arrests, no investigation. The cause of death was labeled epilepsy, but everyone in that room knew better. Britannicus had been erased, and the empire had just entered a new phase of rule. The death of Britannicus shifted the balance of power instantly. Nero was no longer the adopted heir, walking a political tightrope. He was now the last male of the Julio-Claudian bloodline, and the only legal authority in Rome. Agrippina, having lost her leverage, retreated in silence. Her court allies distanced themselves. Her access to decision-making vanished overnight. The same officials who once bowed before her now waited for Nero's orders directly. The Senate took note. No one questioned the cause of death, but everyone adjusted their behavior. Nero was no longer a boy. He had made a clear decision and delivered it with precision. The calm exterior was gone. In its place stood a colder, more calculating emperor. The message was clear. Betrayal, even whispered, would be punished. From this point on, Nero wasn't playing the role of emperor. He had become one in full. Agrippina tried to recover her influence, but it was too late. Nero moved her to a separate residence and restricted her political communications. Her guards were replaced. Her correspondence disappeared. She was no longer part of the imperial court. She was a liability. Seneca and Burrus supported the move, knowing that Nero's paranoia had to be contained before it turned on them. The palace grew quieter, but also more dangerous. Publicly, Nero continued offering games, funding infrastructure, and attending religious events. But privately, he became more isolated. He trusted fewer people. His time with Poppaea increased. His nights were filled with performances and rehearsals, not statecraft. The assassination had worked, and it had changed him. Killing once and surviving it made the next time easier. His conscience, once shaped by fear, had adapted to strategy. Rome had crossed a threshold. The boy emperor who once promised mercy was now a ruler shaped by removal. His enemies didn't fall, they vanished. The court adjusted, the Senate obeyed, and the streets of Rome cheered, unaware of the storm building inside the palace walls. Nero had discovered what real power felt like, and he would never let it go again. Not for the Senate, not for the guard, and not even for the mother who put him there. Poppaea Sabina entered Nero's life at the exact moment he felt most trapped. Beautiful, calculating, and skilled in reading people, she knew how to speak to Nero's insecurities without sounding forceful. She didn't criticize Agrippina directly. She instead questioned why a grown emperor still needed permission to breathe. She reminded Nero that his mother controlled his schedule, his friends, and even his movements. Poppaea whispered possibilities he had never heard: independence, authority, and a life where no one dictated what he could become. Burrus and Seneca noticed the shift before Nero acknowledged it himself. His patience with Agrippina shortened. His statements grew sharper. He spent less time in official meetings and more time behind closed doors with entertainers and Poppaea's circle. Burrus pulled Nero aside and warned him plainly. Removing Agrippina would destabilize Rome, provoke the Senate, and possibly spark military unrest. Seneca, more careful with his words, urged Nero to separate from his mother politically, not violently, but Nero had stopped listening. Nero's paranoia grew faster than anyone expected. He began assuming that every hesitation, delay, or miscommunication in the palace was evidence of Agrippina's plotting. When a general requested reassignment, Nero saw betrayal. When a senator declined an invitation, he suspected loyalty to Agrippina. His mother's silence amplified these fears. She had stopped confronting him directly, which unnerved him. Nero believed she was waiting for the perfect moment to replace him with Britannicus. Despite Britannicus now being dead, logic didn't matter. Fear did. Agrippina didn't help her case. Though removed from the palace, she maintained quiet ties to senators and freedmen who had served under Claudius. She sent private letters reminding allies that the empire had once been stable before Nero. To Nero, those letters sounded like preparation for a coup. Agrippina's motivations were mixed, part pride, part fear, part survival. But Nero didn't see complexity. He saw threat. Every political move she made, real or imagined, deepened his paranoia. The breaking point came when Poppaea asked Nero a question that jolted him. How long will you rule if you let someone else control your future? That single line broke whatever restraint he had left. Burrus's warnings became background noise. Seneca's pleas sounded like excuses. Nero now viewed his mother not as the person who built his throne, but the person who could take it away. The fear that had once kept him obedient now fueled his desire to strike first. The first assassination attempt was designed to look like an accident. Nero invited Agrippina to a private villa, pretending he wanted reconciliation. She accepted the invitation cautiously, sensing tension, but believing she still had influence. That night, her bedroom ceiling was rigged to collapse. The mechanism jammed, causing only a partial fall. Wooden beams crashed but missed her bed. Servants rushed in, claiming structural damage. Agrippina left the villa suspicious but unharmed. The failure pushed Nero into deeper desperation. He needed a method that would not implicate him. His advisors proposed a collapsible ship designed to break apart at sea. Nero approved instantly. The plan was executed with precision. Invite Agrippina to a celebration near the Bay of Naples, escort her to the decorated ship, and wait for the engineered collapse. She boarded smiling, unaware she was stepping onto a death trap. Once offshore, the ship's mechanisms were triggered. When the roof fell and the hull cracked, chaos erupted. One of her attendants drowned instantly as the vessel tipped. Agrippina was thrown into the water but managed to swim. She reached a small fishing boat and returned to shore soaked and bruised. Her survival was not only physical, it was political. She knew the ship was no accident, but instead of accusing Nero publicly, she sent him a single message. She was alive and returning home. That silence terrified him more than any threat. Rome whispered relentlessly after the incident. Everyone heard about the failed ship. Some said it was sabotaged by enemies of the emperor. Others said the gods had intervened. A few whispered the truth in locked rooms. Nero tried to kill his own mother. Nero believed that Agrippina was deliberately letting the rumors spread to weaken him. He felt watched from every direction. Any hesitation from officials was interpreted as a sign that they were waiting for Agrippina's response. Nero reached a point where he felt he only had two options: kill his mother directly or die waiting for her next move. The failures made him reckless. He no longer cared about subtlety or the appearance of legitimacy. Poppaea continued pushing him, telling him that Agrippina would never stop until she had restored control of the empire. Even Seneca and Burrus realized Nero was past the point of negotiation. They feared that if they did not manage the situation, Nero would spiral into uncontrollable violence. With all indirect methods exhausted, Nero ordered a direct execution. He sent a squad of trusted soldiers to Agrippina's villa at Baiae. These were not regular guards. They were hand-picked men whose loyalty was tied to Nero personally. Their assignment was delivered without ceremony or disguise. Eliminate Agrippina and report back immediately. Nero gave no additional instructions. There was no need for subtlety. His decision was final. That night, the armed men entered Agrippina's villa quietly. She was resting when they approached her chambers. When she saw them, she understood the situation instantly. She wasn't confused, shocked, or hysterical. She simply faced the reality she had long feared and long prepared for. According to accounts, she told the soldiers to strike her womb, the place that had carried Nero. It was a final act of defiance, not fear. The guards killed her quickly and left. When the report reached Nero, he panicked. The finality shook him. He didn't celebrate. He didn't sleep. He paced violently, calling for Seneca and demanding a plan. Before the news spread, Seneca advised him to issue a formal claim that Agrippina had plotted to assassinate him and died resisting arrest. It was a lie, but it was the only narrative that could prevent riots or political revolt. Burrus handled the guard, ensuring absolute silence among eyewitnesses. Rome reacted cautiously. Official announcements described Agrippina as a traitor, but private conversations told a different story. Everyone knew Nero's version was impossible. No mother storms a palace with no soldiers behind her. No treason plot ends with a single victim and no conspirators. Still, fear overruled doubt. Senators expressed condolences instead of protests. Officers swore loyalty instead of outrage. Rome may not have believed Nero, but it feared crossing him. Agrippina's death didn't bring Nero relief. It brought nausea, sleeplessness, and paranoia about how Rome would interpret the news. He had crossed the most unforgivable boundary in Roman tradition. Killing political rivals was routine. Killing a mother was not. Nero realized in the aftermath that he could never return to the boy he once pretended to be, and Rome realized it now served an emperor who no longer recognized limits. In the weeks after the assassination, a new version of Nero began to take shape. Burrus noticed the shift immediately. Nero's decisions became impulsive. He stopped consulting advisors and instead relied on his instincts. When Burrus attempted to speak openly about state matters, Nero cut him off or dismissed him. The general who once controlled the guard now felt like a stranger in the palace, watching his influence decay with every passing day. Seneca's position collapsed even faster. Nero no longer valued cautious planning or philosophical arguments. He wanted freedom, not guidance. Seneca saw the danger but could do nothing to stop it. He quietly withdrew from the emperor's daily affairs, hoping distance would keep him safe. Nero interpreted the withdrawal as disloyalty, further deepening his distrust. The relationship that once shaped imperial policy now existed only in public appearance. Poppaea stepped into the vacuum immediately. She became the central voice Nero listened to. She encouraged him to chase pleasure, luxury, and public adoration. She supported his desire to perform on stage and race chariots, a shocking break from imperial tradition. Under her influence, Nero's priorities shifted from governing to performing. He began investing enormous sums in festivals, theaters, and extravagant projects. The Senate saw this as a sign of madness. At the same time, Nero began eliminating anyone connected to Agrippina's past. Relatives who favored Claudius disappeared. Freedmen associated with her administrative circle were quietly executed or exiled. Senators who expressed even mild hesitation were removed from committees or charged with treason. Nero disguised these removals as necessary for public order, but everyone knew the truth. He was erasing every trace of Agrippina from Rome's political structure. By the end of AD 59, the transformation was complete. The boy emperor who once relied on advisors, laws, and tradition, now ruled by impulse, fear replaced respect. Entertainment replaced governance. Poppaea replaced Agrippina. And the throne, once stabilized by family, military, and senate, now belonged solely to Nero's unpredictable will. Rome was heading toward a crisis it could not yet see, but Nero was already living inside the storm he had created. It began on the night of July 18th, 64 AD. The first flames were seen in the merchant stalls along the southeastern edge of the Circus Maximus. The area was packed with wooden shops, straw roofing, and crowded living spaces, perfect fuel for a fast-moving fire. Within hours, high winds turned the flames into a wall of destruction. Entire blocks ignited at once. The fire didn't just burn, it consumed. The blaze spread faster than the city could respond. Water brigades couldn't get close enough. Flames jumped rooftops and collapsing walls blocked escape routes. Rome had no fire department, only citizens with buckets and prayers. Temples, granaries, and shrines turned to ash. Noble villas and poor tenements burned together. Screams echoed through the streets. People fled without direction. Many died not from fire, but from suffocation and panic. By the second night, the fire had crossed 3 districts and threatened the Palatine Hill. Looters disguised as rescue workers took advantage of the chaos. Others claimed to see men adding fuel to the flames, though no one knew if it was true. Rumors spread that the fire was not an accident. Some believed it was divine punishment. Others believed it was political. All agreed on one thing: this wasn't ordinary. When the fires were finally contained after 6 full days, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been touched by flame. 3 were completely destroyed. Thousands of citizens were homeless. Businesses were gone. Art, literature, and ancestral homes were lost forever. No emperor in Roman history had ever seen his capital brought so low, so fast. When Nero returned from Antium, the damage had already been done, and so had the Whispers. From the moment he arrived, people watched his reaction. He ordered food and shelter for the homeless, opened public gardens, and lowered grain prices to prevent riots. But none of it silenced the rumors. Why wasn't he in Rome when it started? Why were fire brigades delayed in certain neighborhoods? Why were cleared areas already marked for construction? Nero wasn't just facing a burned city, he was facing a collapsing image. At first, Nero's efforts to aid survivors earned some praise. He walked through the rubble personally, offering words of comfort. He funded emergency housing and ordered public buildings rebuilt using stone instead of wood. But the goodwill didn't last. Whispers turned into accusations. Some claimed he had watched the city burn while performing music at his villa. Others said he had orchestrated the fire to clear space for his urban redesign. Nero denied the rumors, but they refused to die. The Senate was divided. Some praised his generosity. Others accused him of exploiting a tragedy. Behind closed doors, veteran senators recalled his history. The boy who killed his brother, then his mother. Now they believed he had burned his own city. Nero didn't respond to the Whispers with transparency. He responded with silence and increasingly lavish gestures. Merchants who lost their inventory in the fire were furious. They received no compensation. Landowners couldn't rebuild because new zoning laws suddenly restricted reconstruction. Nero had declared certain areas imperial reserve zones, land that conveniently matched the worst burned districts. This fed a darker theory, that the fire had been part of a real estate scheme. The destroyed areas were already being surveyed by architects and engineers. The poor, now homeless and hungry, turned to blame. They couldn't reach the Senate. They couldn't confront palace officials, but they could talk in the streets. And what they said echoed louder than any official edict. The idea that the emperor had let the city burn, or worse, caused it, spread like smoke in a dry forest. Nero's popularity didn't just drop, it shattered. Desperate to contain the damage, Nero needed someone else to carry the blame. He couldn't arrest senators or generals without proof. He couldn't punish the merchant class without risking rebellion. But he could target a group that had no power, no allies, and no protection from the state. He needed a scapegoat, and Rome had already chosen one, without even realizing it. The Christians had always been outsiders in Rome. They refused to participate in public rituals. They rejected the gods, the emperor's divinity, and the traditions of Roman life. Their meetings were secret, their customs strange, and their loyalty questioned. The public already viewed them with suspicion. All Nero had to do was point. The rest happened fast. He ordered mass arrests across the city. Christian leaders were detained, interrogated, and tortured. Names were extracted, lists compiled. Entire families were dragged from their homes in the night. Some confessed under pain, others simply vanished. The charge was arson. The punishment was public. Nero didn't want silent trials. He wanted a spectacle. Executions were held in the arena. Christians were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified and set on fire to light Nero's gardens at night. The public was told these were the people who destroyed Rome. At first, the crowds cheered, but after weeks of blood, even they began to flinch. Children screamed. Women turned away. The cruelty was no longer seen as justice, but as entertainment masking guilt. Senators watched the purge in silence. They knew Nero's story didn't hold. No arsonist could have coordinated such widespread destruction. No group of religious outcasts could have overwhelmed Rome's infrastructure. But they said nothing. To speak meant suspicion. To protest meant risk. And so, as Christians burned, Rome's political elite stayed quiet and looked away. This marked a collapse in Nero's rule, not in power, but in morality. He no longer feared appearances, he no longer balanced politics with perception. He used violence, not as a tool, but as a shield. The Christians didn't just die in the arena, they were sacrificed to preserve a crumbling image of control. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. With the rubble still warm and the execution still ongoing, Nero began building. Not homes, not temples, not shelters for the displaced. He began constructing his personal vision of a new capital. At the heart of it was the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It wasn't just a palace. It was a complex of gardens, halls, lakes, and rotating dining rooms covered in marble and gold leaf. It stretched over land cleared by the fire. The cost was staggering. Imported stone, Greek architects, and an army of slaves worked around the clock. While thousands still lived in tents, Nero poured the treasury into his pleasure dome. The Senate watched in silence. No one dared question the emperor while he still held the city in mourning and the blood of the accused on his hands. But frustration built behind the scenes. Treasury officials warned that state funds were running dangerously low. Payments to provincial governors were delayed. Soldiers grumbled that wages had not been paid on time. Grain shipments from Egypt were disrupted. The financial consequences of the fire were now being felt in every corner of the empire. Nero ignored the signs he believed he was building legacy, not debt. Poppaea, ever present at his side, encouraged him. She told him that artists weren't bound by tradition, that emperors didn't just rule. They transformed. Nero believed her. He began seeing himself not as a ruler of Rome, but as a visionary who would reshape the city, the people, and history itself. Every wall, every statue, every arch was now about Nero. Not the gods, not the Senate, not even the empire. Rome had burned, the people had suffered, the treasury bled, and in the center of it all, the emperor was designing his dream. He had blamed, silenced, and survived. And now, with no rivals and no restraint, Nero began to build a version of Rome that only he could understand, and only he would ever control. By AD 65, Rome had changed, and so had its emperor. Nero was no longer the boy molded by tutors and controlled by guards. He was unpredictable, theatrical, and feared inside the Senate. Unease grew silently. Officials avoided eye contact during imperial speeches. Military governors sent fewer reports, and then came Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a charismatic, wealthy senator who gave voice to what many were afraid to say. Nero had to be removed before the empire collapsed from within. Piso was not a revolutionary. He was calculated. He had friends in high places, money to bribe, and just enough popularity to make people listen. His vision wasn't radical. It was restoration. He wanted to remove Nero, install a steady hand, and bring Rome back to traditional rule. He didn't plot alone. Senators, philosophers, equestrians, writers, soldiers, even members of the imperial court joined the network. Everyone had different reasons, but one shared goal: end Nero's reign. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal to Nero, had also begun to fracture. Some officers were recruited into the conspiracy. They had seen Agrippina's assassination. They had seen Seneca's sidelining. They knew Nero killed without consequence, and that their own loyalty could someday cost them their lives. Piso's allies promised higher pay, restored dignity and protection under a new regime. In secret chambers, knives were sharpened, not for show, but for execution. Meetings took place across villas, theaters, and private bathhouses. Messages were passed through actors, scribes, and dancers. At its peak, the conspiracy included over 40 named individuals and dozens more unknown. Their plan was timed for the games. Piso would approach Nero publicly, a soldier would strike, Piso would address the crowd and declare emergency succession. It would be fast, brutal, and, if successful, bloodless for Rome. But Rome doesn't run on clean plans. Someone talked. Someone feared being caught on the wrong side of history. The plan was discovered not by accident, but by betrayal. A freedman overheard whispers. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough. Instead of staying silent, he went straight to the palace. Within days, Nero knew what was coming and ordered Rome to prepare for the purge. The moment the conspiracy reached Nero's ears, he did not hesitate. There was no quiet investigation, no subtle arrests. The reaction was instant and theatrical. Nero summoned the Senate, screamed accusations, and declared that treason had infected the state. His fear turned to rage. His rage turned to violence. What followed was not a crackdown. It was a massacre of names, titles, and legacies. Dozens were arrested within hours. Piso was detained and executed immediately. No trial, no hearing. His allies were dragged from homes, streets, and meetings. Friends betrayed friends. Husbands turned on wives. The air in Rome shifted. The people saw officials vanish overnight. One day, a senator stood in the forum. The next day, his property was confiscated and his name erased. Nero wasn't restoring order. He was decimating threats before they could speak again. Seneca was one of the highest-profile casualties. Though he had no proven role in the plot, Nero no longer trusted him. The emperor sent a messenger, not with guards, but with a command Seneca was to take his own life. The philosopher, once a father figure to Nero, complied without protest. He opened his veins in the Roman tradition, calm, controlled, and silent. He died not as a traitor, but as a symbol of the end of reason in Nero's court. The executions continued for weeks. Writers, generals, nobles, none were spared. Some were public, others disappeared without announcement. Nero claimed he had saved Rome. He called it justice, but the Senate saw through the theater. What Nero feared was no longer betrayal. He feared truth. The conspiracy was real, but his response revealed more than the crime. It showed that Nero ruled now from panic, not from strength. With Seneca gone and Burrus dead the year before, Nero stood alone. No counselors, no commanders with history, no more family. The court around him was now filled with flatterers, spies, and performers. Those who survived the purge didn't cheer. They watched their backs. Nero had defeated the conspiracy, but in doing so, he proved that Rome had no emperor. It had only a man too scared to be challenged. Amid the growing chaos, Nero's last emotional anchor was Poppaea Sabina. She had risen from mistress to wife to empress. She understood him better than anyone, and unlike Seneca or Burrus, she didn't try to control him. She encouraged his performances, laughed at his jokes, and supported his fantasies of being more than a ruler, an artist, a god. For years, Poppaea held his loyalty, his confidence, and at times his sanity. But even that bond fractured. In AD 65, during her second pregnancy, Poppaea died. Roman sources disagree on the exact cause. Some say illness. Others say Nero struck her during an argument, possibly over a late return home or a misunderstood word. Whatever the truth, she collapsed, and the imperial physicians failed to save her. She was gone within hours. Nero was told the news. For the first time in years, he wept, not for show, but from shock. Her death broke something inside him. Nero withdrew from state affairs. He refused meetings. He canceled public appearances. He disappeared into private gardens and theater rehearsals. He ordered Poppaea embalmed in spices and ivory, then enshrined in the mausoleum of Augustus, a gesture once reserved for gods and heroes. Rome expected him to appoint a new empress. He didn't. He performed love poems instead. Grief didn't humble him. It dissolved what little structure remained. He stopped pretending to govern. He left treasury matters to unqualified friends. He ignored military reports. He became obsessed with touring the Greek provinces, not as emperor, but as a performer. He played the lyre. He raced in chariot arenas. He demanded applause. The Senate, stunned, had no instructions. The Guard, confused, had no orders. Nero ruled through absence and fear. Behind the performances, a darker shift took hold. Without Poppeia's influence, Nero stopped regulating his impulses. He grew crueler, less predictable. His inner circle lived in constant anxiety. Jokes became accusations. Praise was required. Punishments were irrational. Rome still called him emperor. But the man sitting on the throne no longer lived in the real world. He lived in a version of it, built around himself and no one else. While Nero sang and posed before crowds, the real empire began to rot. In Gaul, the governor Gaius Julius Vindex, loyal to Rome but disgusted with Nero, refused to continue paying excessive imperial taxes. He denounced Nero publicly, calling him a disgrace to the Principate. Vindex wasn't alone. In Spain, another governor, Servius Sulpicius Galba, quietly began mobilizing troops. He declared himself the legate of the Senate and the people of Rome. These weren't barbarian revolts. These were senior Roman officials rejecting Nero's authority. Governors in Africa and Egypt withheld full support, waiting to see who would come out on top. The eastern provinces were silent but not loyal. Even within Italy, local officials hesitated to obey new decrees from Rome. The empire's outer shell remained, but inside, the imperial structure was cracking wide open. The treasury was nearly empty. Years of artistic vanity, grand festivals, and the Golden House had drained state funds. Nero had sold palace furniture to cover costs. Army salaries were delayed for months. Veterans grumbled about betrayal. New recruits were poorly equipped. Commanders sent requests for reinforcement and received silence. The legions, once the heart of Roman dominance, were now unpaid, ignored, and angry. Even the Praetorian Guard, Nero's last line of defense, began shifting its position. They had once guarded him with precision and loyalty, but now they quietly opened channels of communication with Galba. They listened, they negotiated, they asked questions. Nero didn't notice. Or if he did, he pretended it wasn't happening. He was still preparing for a performance tour in Greece, completely detached from the empire sliding out from under him. By the time Rome began preparing for Galba's arrival, it was too late. Nero had lost the Senate, he had lost the army, he had lost the treasury. He had no heir, no wife, and no clear path to regain power. His isolation was no longer emotional, it was absolute. The conspiracies were gone. The enemies were real. And the emperor, who had once silenced the city, now stood alone, listening only to his own voice in a world that had already moved on. As the empire staggered under revolt and conspiracies, Nero's court became stranger by the day. In AD 67, the emperor married Sporus, a teenage boy who resembled Poppaea Sabina. The Empress Nero had fatally kicked while she was pregnant. Nero had the boy castrated and then staged a full imperial wedding, complete with a bridal veil, dowry, and formal procession. Sporus was even referred to as Sabina and forced to play the role of Nero's lost wife in public ceremonies. To outsiders, it looked like madness, but to Nero, this was a twisted attempt to undo the past. His guilt had turned into performance, and Rome became the stage for his grief. To many senators and palace officials, the marriage confirmed that Nero had lost all sense of imperial dignity. This wasn't just personal, it was political. While governors were declaring rebellion in the provinces, their emperor was parading a boy dressed as a dead woman through the halls of power. Some sources believed the wedding was Nero's way of trying to redeem himself for Poppeia's death. Others saw it as another form of domination, to remake the past by forcing the living to imitate the dead. Either way, it signaled a disturbing shift in Nero's psychology, one from control to collapse. The union with Sporus wasn't private or symbolic. Nero demanded it to be treated like any legitimate Roman marriage. The boy stood beside him in public, dressed as empress, receiving guests, and playing his part in Nero's fantasy. It shocked the Senate, horrified the people, and gave further ammunition to the growing chorus of dissent. Sporus became a living symbol of an emperor, consumed by guilt and unchecked power. The line between performance and reality had vanished, and Nero was now acting a role he could no longer control. Behind the walls of Nero's golden palace, fear deepened. No one dared question the spectacle, but many took it as proof that the emperor was spiraling. Even Seneca, long exiled from Nero's trust, would not have believed how far his former pupil had fallen. Poppeia's death had not just broken Nero's heart, it had shattered his grip on reason. And now, with the empire burning from the inside out, Rome's most powerful man was chasing ghosts through corridors of marble and shame. As news of the marriage spread across the provinces, governors already skeptical of Nero's leadership now saw a ruler detached from the reality of war and politics. Galba in Spain, Vindex in Gaul, and others saw their moment. Rome had an emperor who seemed more interested in reviving the dead than defending the living. And while Nero clung to a fantasy bride, the empire quietly prepared for a future without him. By mid-June AD 68, Nero's hold on Rome had turned to smoke. The Praetorian Guard, the elite force tasked with protecting the emperor, stopped following his orders. They had listened to Galba's promises of bonuses and reforms. They calculated their chances, and they turned. Overnight, Nero was no longer their emperor. His personal guards were dismissed. His palace staff stopped receiving orders. Silence took over the imperial corridors like a final verdict. The Senate, long resentful and afraid, suddenly found its voice. Once Nero lost the guard, senators saw their moment. They met in the emergency session, weighing whether to support Galba or wait. The debate ended quickly when news arrived. The Praetorian Guard had pledged full allegiance to Galba. Nero had no legions in Rome, no generals in his pocket, and no allies in the chamber. One senator stood and said what others wouldn't. He must be declared an enemy of the state. If you were a senator sitting in that chamber, would you speak or stay quiet and live? Within hours, the Senate issued a formal decree. Nero was condemned as a public enemy, a man unfit to rule, stripped of the imperial privilege. Word spread fast. Nero's name was erased from official documents. Sculptures were quietly removed. Priests stopped mentioning him in rituals. Coins with his face were no longer accepted. What had taken years to build was undone in a single day of fear and calculation. Inside the palace, Nero received the message, "You are no longer emperor." It didn't come as a shock, but as a silence. Guards left their posts. Advisors stopped knocking. The city no longer answered to him. Rome was calm, but it wasn't waiting. It had already moved on. Nero was awake, but politically dead. For the first time, the emperor faced something he had never experienced: total abandonment. He looked for one more play, one more command, one more solution, but there was none. No armies, no officials, no assassins to silence dissent. Nero walked through the same halls where he had once reigned like a god, and now every shadow was unfamiliar. He understood what had happened. The man who had once killed to survive had no one left to kill. Rome had chosen peace over him. Before sunrise, Nero gathered a few loyal slaves and disappeared. No chariots, no fanfare. He left through the side gates dressed in plain clothes. He rode through the back roads of Rome like a fugitive, passing temples he once rebuilt, markets he once taxed, and statues that once bore his image. Every block reminded him that the city he ruled no longer answered to his voice. He wasn't running from enemies, he was running from history. He reached the villa of a freedman named Phaon, a quiet estate outside the city used mostly for leisure. Now it became a final refuge. Nero didn't eat, he didn't sleep. He paced. He wrote a speech asking Galba to spare his life. He practiced begging. He tried to write poetry. None of it calmed him. Slaves reported that his hands shook constantly, and he kept asking one question: "Is anyone coming for me?" News reached him slowly. First, the Senate had confirmed Galba. Then, the Praetorian Guard was hunting him. Then, he had been sentenced to death in the ancient style. Beaten naked to death with rods in public, Nero dropped the scroll he had written. He knew what that meant. It wasn't a trial. It was humiliation. The Emperor of Rome was now no more than a criminal in hiding. He sent messengers to old allies, governors, generals, even former advisors. No one responded. Those who had once flattered him now stayed silent. Their loyalty had never been to him, only to power. And now he had none. The villa grew colder. The rooms felt smaller. Even his slaves began whispering among themselves. Nero realized that not even his last circle could protect him. Rome had done what he once feared. It moved on. In his final hours, Nero tried bargaining with reality. He asked if he could flee to Egypt. He asked if Galba would let him live in exile. He asked if anyone had betrayed him to save themselves. But the questions didn't matter anymore. He wasn't emperor. He wasn't a performer. He was a hunted man waiting for the sound of soldiers on gravel. What terrified him most wasn't death. It was being seen as weak when they came. The soldiers arrived just before dawn. Nero heard them before he saw them. The heavy steps in the dirt, the creak of armor, the final confirmation that it was over. He stood in the center of the room, frozen. He looked for a sword. He found none. His guards had disarmed him days ago. He asked one slave for a dagger. The man handed it to him with shaking hands. Nero took it, but couldn't lift it. He panicked. His eyes darted around the room. He asked if someone else could do it. He begged. No one moved. One freedman, Epaphroditus, stepped forward. He understood what Nero wanted, not to die, but not to be captured. The emperor lowered the blade to his throat but couldn't push it in. His hand trembled. His lips muttered final words. Then Epaphroditus did what Nero could not. He drove the blade. As the soldiers entered, Nero collapsed onto the floor. Blood filled his mouth. His final words, recorded by witnesses, were strange and desperate. Qualis artifex perio, translated loosely, "What an artist dies with me." It wasn't about power. It wasn't about Rome. It was about how he wanted to be remembered. Not as a tyrant, but as a performer, misunderstood and unloved. The soldiers stood over him in silence. One checked his pulse. Another took a ring from his hand to deliver as proof. There was no honor, no ritual, just silence and blood. The body of the last Julio Claudian emperor was burned privately and buried in a simple tomb by a few loyal servants. No public funeral, no mourning. The dynasty that began with Augustus had ended with a man begging to be forgotten. In the end, Nero died as he lived, surrounded by performance, haunted by fear, and obsessed with how the world would remember him. Rome didn't cheer, it didn't weep, it simply kept going. The emperor, who once filled arenas, could not even fill his own grave. Galba entered Rome as a restorer, not a conqueror. The Senate declared him emperor without resistance. His first act was symbolic. He ordered the removal of Nero's statues from public places. Sculptors worked through the night, chiseling faces off marble. Coins were melted down. Nero's name was scratched from official records. The empire didn't just change rulers, it tried to erase one. The Julio Claudian line had ended. From Augustus to Tiberius to Caligula to Claudius to Nero, the dynasty had ruled for nearly a century. Its collapse left a vacuum. Galba promised reform, but his rule would last only months. Rome was not entering an age of peace. It was entering a time of civil war. What Nero's death gave Rome wasn't clarity. It was chaos, disguised as transition. Still, across the provinces, order began to return, at least temporarily. Governors pledged loyalty to Galba. Legions received overdue payments. the treasury tried to stabilize. The public, exhausted from Nero's final years, welcomed the illusion of normalcy. But fear lingered beneath the surface. They had watched an emperor fall from god to ghost, and they knew how quickly power could break men. Nero's legacy twisted immediately. Some saw him as a monster, vain, cruel, and reckless. Others saw him as a tragic artist, trapped in a role he never asked for. In the eastern provinces, stories emerged that he had faked his death and would return. Some believed it, others didn't. But the fact that the myth lived on said something: Nero had failed as emperor. But he had succeeded at being unforgettable. Rome had tried to erase him, but history wouldn't allow it. For centuries to come, his name would be remembered not for what he built, but for what he burned. Not for who he loved, but for who he destroyed. And in every discussion of power without restraint, his shadow remained. Nero had died alone, but his story never would. If you'd like us to cover another Roman emperor who nearly destroyed the empire in his own way, tell us who in the comments.